Good morning, MacLaren. Today is Thursday, March 26th, 2020. The weather today, sunshine to start, then a few afternoon clouds, high of 64 degrees. Some gusty winds today, and it looks as though we will see some rain and snow showers on Friday night. The sun rose today at 6:52 a.m. and will set at 7:17 p.m. Amazingly enough, on this date, March 26th, in the year 1953, Dr. Jonas Salk announced on the radio that he had successfully tested a vaccine against poliomyelitis, the virus that causes the crippling disease of polio. And that is all that I want to talk about to you today. So, if we go back in time to the 19th century, the 1800s, it is summertime in Vermont, and suddenly there is an outbreak of a terrible disease that affects babies and young children, children under the age of 5. Affects them much more than it affects adults. There were some adults who contracted it. Famously, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president who led the country through the Depression and World War II, had polio. But largely, it was a disease of young children, and it was awful. Children would become very sick. They couldn't move. They were paralyzed. Some even died. Many children who recovered still had some amount of partial paralysis, so maybe they couldn't move, say, one leg or both legs. And after that first epidemic in Vermont, thousands and thousands of people contracted polio every year, and there was no way to treat it beyond quarantine and the very kind of scary looking machine called an iron lung. It's this big metal tube that your whole body would go into, just your head would stick out. And that was to help children breathe. So there were these regular outbreaks of polio. People were terrified. One historian says that apart from the atomic bomb, America's greatest fear was polio. That's the backdrop of the story of Dr. Jonas Salk. Jonas Salk was born in New York City in 1914. His parents were both immigrants from Eastern Europe. They were Jewish, and they had not had the chance to go to much school themselves. But Jonas was very bright, and he went to a special school that was intended for smart kids whose families didn't have the money to send them to an elite private school. And at his school, the students did a 4-year curriculum in 3 years' time. So it was very hard, very rigorous, very grueling. A lot of students dropped out. Uh, the school's motto was study, study, study. That was their motto. um, and Jonas was a perfectionist. His fellow students knew him as someone who read everything he could put his hands on. And he was very advanced. He went to CCNY, the City College of New York, when he was just 15 years old. CCNY was the place to go for bright, hardworking children of working class immigrant families. And in that period of time, the 1930s and 40s, many, many Nobel Prize winners came out of the CCNY system. So Jonas studied chemistry there, and he went on to medical school. And in med school, he was different from his peers. Not just because he was so smart, but because he had decided he didn't really want to practice medicine. He didn't want to be a normal doctor. What he loved was research, and he became more and more focused on bacteriology, studying the science of bacteria. And his desire was not to help individual patients, but was to help humankind. And he really loved lab work. He loved being in a laboratory. Did a lot of work on the influenza virus, the flu, and he helped to develop flu vaccines during World War II. By the late 1940s, he had his own research laboratory and was given a grant to study the polio virus and develop a possible vaccine. So that was what he spent all his time on, and he worked on that for a few years. And by 1950, he had an early version of the polio vaccine, but it wasn't tested. So what was the procedure? Well, he would take strains of the polio virus and he would kill them and inject those dead viruses, which are now benign, they couldn't hurt you anymore, into the bloodstream of a healthy person. So from there, that person's immune system would see that polio virus and would attack it and would kind of learn how it worked and would create antibodies that would resist any future exposure to the polio virus. If you remember, we talked about a very similar process with those early smallpox inoculations that happened in colonial America. We talked about that, I don't know, a couple of months ago at Morning Assembly. So he still had to test this possible vaccine. So he did the first human trials, first on former polio patients who had recovered. And then he started testing the vaccine on himself and on his own family. And by 1953, he was ready to announce his findings. So he announced them on the radio, and he became overnight a celebrity. And in 1954, large-scale clinical trials using his vaccine began on almost 2 million American children. After a year, it was announced that the vaccine was effective and safe, and a campaign began to inoculate every child in America. Jonas Salk was always very independent, very private, and he didn't want his work as a scientist to be about shining a light on him personally. And he didn't want to take credit for the vaccine. One TV personality asked him, "Who owns the patent on this polio vaccine?" And Jonas Salk said, "There is no patent. Could you patent the sun?" Bear in mind that it has been calculated that if the polio vaccine had been patented, the patent would have been worth $7 billion. And Jonas Salk refused to patent it. He was a superstar. If he went on an airplane, the pilot would say, "Dr. Jonas Salk is on our airplane today," and the whole plane would burst into applause. If he checked into a hotel, they would put him in their fanciest suite. He couldn't go out to eat at a restaurant without admirers coming up and wanting to talk to him. Even scientists were in awe of him. Over time, he was given presidential citations and commendations, many awards, honorary degrees. He was given decorations by foreign governments. Thousands and thousands of people wrote him letters. But he didn't want to be famous. He didn't want to be a celebrity. He thought that it was inappropriate for a scientist to be a famous person, and he just wanted to go back into his laboratory. Jonas Salk died from heart failure. He was 80 years old in 1995 in La Jolla, California. Today, there are just a very small handful of polio cases in the United States each year. Most of them come from Americans who go abroad to countries, developing countries where polio is still a problem, and they bring it back. But the disease has effectively been eradicated in the United States. This disease that was so terrorizing to generations of Americans has been more or less eradicated and hopefully will continue to be eradicated around the world. So, all of you out there, take heart, tend to your victory gardens, keep a pleasant schedule, keep a routine, get plenty of fresh air and exercise, be a helper to your family. Please don't squabble with your siblings. If it is your birthday today, March 26th, 2020, happy birthday. I hope you have a day of kindness, friendliness, and peace. We are all in this together. We'll see you next time.